A story about the Green Bay Packers, it's about as warm and fuzzy as nonfiction can get.
They were a small-town team right from the start.
It's certainly the little town that could. It's the professional town with a college spirit.
You'll see teams just make a big deal out of a playoff berth or a wild card berth. Not in Green Bay. It's championships.
It's the only surviving small-town professional sports team in America.
You know, you play long enough, things aren't going to always go right for you.
They faced one obstacle after another from the day they were born.
Gentlemen, this is the most important play we have. The play we must make, though.
The big football trophy is coming home where it started.
Anybody who would start a football team in a little city like this, the driving force behind its survival, is an amazing story.
It's truly unique. There's no other story like it in sports, and so much of it is what Curly did.
Lambeau had a dream, and he accomplished it. He manifested it.
Curly Lambeau in his senior annual makes a comment about after athletics, he's going to conquer the world. Little does he know that through athletics, through football, he's actually going to conquer the world.
In a day where the signature of big business is emblazoned across most NFL stadiums, the name of a man is the moniker of what may be the country's most famous football shrine, Lambeau.
He was a real inspirational guy, and he demanded a lot, and we respect him, and he got a lot out of us.
He had that charm that he could sell a person about joining the Packers team. He was a leader, obviously, not only starting the Packers, but to the longevity, to stay.
He was a man, obviously, of great ambition. The key to his success as coach of the Packers was he was a great recruiter.
He was a really good salesman, and it was his keen eye for talent and his persuasiveness, the way he talked to people and brought them in.
The story of the Green Bay franchise is a spectacular sports drama. Where would you ever suspected that a town of 45,000 would get a franchise and compete against the big cities in the National Football League?
Writers in New York are writing that until the NFL throws Green Bay out of the league, it'll never be big time. They're on top of the world, yet they're really not.
As a new decade dawns, Green Bay is winning games, but not producing enough revenue.
Packers are coming off a championship season where they made $1,000.
Financially, they just weren't bringing in the money that the bigger New York, Chicago, those type cities were bringing in.
When the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the Packers were still selling only about 2,000 season tickets.
The NFL of that time was still a small operation. It was a minor sport. College football was the big sport, and pro football was an afterthought. It was not very well covered. It was not very well attended.
August 1940. The season begins with Lambeau's nucleus intact. The Green Bay Packers square off against the college all-stars at Soldier Field.
It was the NFL champion of the previous season playing a group of college draft picks of NFL teams put together for just that one game.
And at that time, Soldier Field held 85,000. So it was the biggest stage in football. So that was another appeal to Lambeau. Lambeau had a big ego.
It is a crowd of well over 84,000.
In the early years, the college teams could hold their own with the pros.
Adding strength to the college experts' opinion that they were on the same level as professional football teams.
Lambeau had lost to the All-Stars the first time the Packers played him. Revenge was on his mind.
Arch Ward, who created the College All-Star Game, was never quite convinced that we were better than the college teams because we didn't beat them.
We got back at them and beat them 45-28.
And Arch Ward says pro football has finally arrived.
I asked him one time, what do you think was a singular thing that you accomplished as a coach? He said, you know, you'll be surprised, the 1940 College All-Star Game.
Up until the day he died, he called it his biggest victory.
Said because at that time, people were still thinking that college football was on the same level as pro football.
And that might seem odd to football fans today because it's still listed as an exhibition game in the all-time scores.
With this personal victory behind him, Lambeau now feels the sky's the limit. On a frigid day, November 1940, the Packers board a United Airline flight bound for New York.
Curly was, known as an innovator of sorts.
Packers were the first team to fly to a road game.
They took a train to Chicago and cabs to the airport. They boarded 2 DC-12s to fly to New York.
The league required them to fly in 2 airplanes, fearing the possibility of a hard disaster that would wipe out the franchise.
They had to stop in Cleveland to refuel.
The milestone is marred.
There was fog in New York, and they wouldn't be able to continue the trip.
They had to take a train from Cleveland to New York.
And got there about 12 hours late. Fortunately, they had left 3 days early.
1941 starts much like 1940.
Teams knew that if they had the Packers on their schedule, they were going to have a good turnout that day for the game.
They were still a good draw on the road.
George Halas was happy with that down in Chicago. Some of his biggest crowds for the Packer game down there every year.
At home, it's a different story. Ticket sales continue to disappoint. NFL owners are losing money when they play in Green Bay.
1941, Curly Lambeau comes back from the NFL's annual meeting where they set the schedule, and he only has, at that point, 2 teams, Chicago and Detroit, willing to play in Green Bay. Nobody else wants to play here.
Green Bay was just too small to support a professional football team, especially at that time.
The Packers were having trouble drawing for some of their home games. They'd always get a sellout for the Bears, usually a big crowd for Detroit, but the other game was always a tough sell, particularly if it fell on deer hunting weekend. Men in Green Bay do have their priorities.
The board of directors tap into the well that is their constant support. They meet with over 40 of Green Bay's most prominent business leaders to discuss plans for an upcoming season ticket drive.
So it's something that was just inbred into the community. A lot of people that just love football and wanted to see it survive.
So they set a goal in 41 to try to sell 5,000. They felt that was what they needed to stay in the league.
The Packers fall short again. They sell 2,864 season tickets, not much more than half. The Packers end the season 10-1. The Bears are 9-1, with another week to play. The Packers are assured no less than a tie for the Western Division title.
The Bears had one more game left. They needed to win to force a playoff. So the Packers took a train from Green Bay to Chicago, go down to Comiskey Park to watch the Cardinals play the Bears.
That's a big game. If the Bears get beat, we'll be Western Division champions, and we'll be in the NFL championship game.
The Chicago Bears beat the Chicago Cardinals and force a playoff game against the Packers. December 7th, 1941.
They were sitting in the end zone at Comiskey Park when the announcement was made.
Special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor, that drew the United States into World War II.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The immediate reaction of the players was that they knew they were going off to war. They also knew that they had a football game to play the next weekend. The Bears were the monsters of the Midway at the time and were favorites. That game was an instant sellout, 42,000.
The Bears reign victorious, defeating the Packers 33-14 at Wrigley Field.
The Bear-Packer series, they created a lot of interest. These men were in the limelight. The publicity they got extended beyond Green Bay in Wisconsin.
The following week, Chicago hosts the New York Giants for the NFL championship game. The attendance, a mere 13,000.
The Bear-Packer game was bigger than the NFL championship game. The fans just didn't think that would be as good of a game because the Giants weren't the Packers.
1942. The United States is at war. Every community affected. The Green Bay Press-Gazette is riddled with stories from the front.
NFL was greatly affected by World War II because of how many people, personnel, had to go into service.
Some, of course, volunteered, but some were drafted right out of school, taken out of their senior year.
Some teams merged during the war years just to be able to survive. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh merged. They were called the Steagles, and they played together 1 year, and then in 44, the Cardinals merged with the Steelers, and they were called the Card Pit.
35 Packers are active players when they are called to serve.
If you get drafted, or you're part of a reserve unit or the National Guard and you're getting called up, you are going to go.
Among them, Packers back Tony Canadeo, drafted by Green Bay in 1941. He plays only 3 games of the 44 championship season and misses all of the 45 season while serving.
My son was born, I came home on furlough. And that's the only reason I played the 3 games. I wouldn't have played 3 games if we didn't fake my wife having relapses. And they called me back and say they needed me. And I was playing for the Packers. I could have cried all the way back to Fort Bliss when I had to go back.
He was a very durable halfback, multifunctional. He could run, he could pass, he could block, he could throw.
One of those players well respected by his teammates because of what a fierce competitor he was.
Only the 3rd player in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards.
All the desire in the world, a real pleasure to watch him run with the ball. On top of that, one of the finest fellows you ever met in your life.
Football is not going to be the main thing in your life. Serving your country is going to be the main thing.
There was consideration given to canceling the seasons. The league didn't, but they lost a lot of players. A lot of over-the-hill veterans were called back. The league was just desperate for players.
How are you going to be the same team you were if you lose a number of your main, people?
Howard Smiley Johnson, a guard in 1940 and 41, is a 2nd lieutenant with the 23rd Marines. Killed on active duty in Iwo Jima at the age of 28. He is the only Packers casualty of World War II. He dies a hero, the recipient of 2 Silver Stars.
The guys that came back from that war, regardless of where it was in this country, knew they were the luckiest people in the world.
They worked hard, but they also had learned how to party hard because they didn't know if they'd still be there the next day. They had seen the worst that humanity can offer. Their outlet was family, work, fun, and it was also the Green Bay Packers.
Despite losing players to the war in a constantly changing landscape on the field, Don Hudson excels at his game.
He was fast, but he didn't run full speed all the time. A defensive back play him close, and pretty soon he put it on and pass you by.
My rookie year, I'll never forget getting ready for this guy called Don Hudson. Some runners, receivers, have strides that are harder to judge as far as pace goes. And he sort of ran skating along. And then he gave me a little extra speed, a little extra move. And while he was running in there for touchdown land, I started to jog to the bench because I knew I was going to end up right there.
When people talk about the greatest Packer ever, people today would put Hudson at the top of the list among the early Packers.
His best season, one of the 2 years that he won the MVP, he had 74 receptions for 1,211 yards and 17 touchdowns.
74 catches. The guy in 2nd place, Pop Ivy, had 27.
He had 2 great passers before I came up throwing the ball to him, Arnie Herber and Cecil Isbell. And then I came from a smaller school, and it took a while to calm down. You felt embarrassed when you threw it over his head or something like that.
3rd down for the Packers, still 2 yards to go.
Russ Winnie, he was the Packer voice from 1929 to 1946.
Signals called to the open, the ball goes back to Herbert. Herbert fades off to the left, he throws a pass to Hudson. Hudson takes it in the end zone, it's complete for a touchdown, and the Packers win.
I can remember Russ saying time and time again, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I know I keep saying this, but I don't know how Don Hudson caught that ball. How did he catch it?
I was fast enough. I ran the sprints up on the track team in college. And I could catch the ball from the time I started in high school. The fundamentals seemed to come natural to me.
There's a sports writer that called Don Hudson the Babe Ruth of football. That's a pretty high compliment.
Big part of the Packers' success when they win championships in 1936, 39, and 44. He makes big plays, catches touchdown passes. He was a one-of-a-kind end.
You could argue that he's perhaps one of the great players of NFL history.
In 1941, Don Hudson is named the winner of the NFL's Most Valuable Player Award, which carries with it the Joe F. Carr Trophy. It is an honor repeated in 1942.
When he was the most valuable player in the league, I wrote him a letter congratulating him, and he answered me. So I have a personal letter from Don Hudson. Thanks, Jack. Glad to hear that the boys at St. Norbert are behind me. That was a short letter. The guy did everything, and he had a terrific game. They played in Milwaukee. They played the Detroit Lions.
The Packers, early in the second quarter of that game, they were down 7-0 at halftime. They were leading 41-7. They'd scored 41 unanswered points, and they went on to win the game 57-21. And Don Hudson, the great Don Hudson, caught 4 touchdown passes and kicked 5 extra points, among those 41 points in the second quarter. I talked to Gus DeRay, who was the head coach of the Lions after the game, and he said, "I'll give it to you in 3 words, too much, Hudson."
He played 11 NFL seasons. 8 times he led the NFL in receptions. 7 times he led the NFL in receiving yards. And 5 times he led the overall league in scoring.
His records, 488 catches, almost 8,000 yards receiving, 99 receiving touchdowns. Those records weren't broken for decades.
When he retired from the game, he was the leading scorer in the history of professional football, the leading receiver in the history of professional football, and the second leading interceptor in the history of professional football with 30 interceptions as a defensive back. And he also kicked short-range field goals and extra points. Aside from that, he didn't do too much.
The Packers continue success on the field. All of it covered by the Green Bay Press-Gazette. Written by a determined and talented sports writer, Art Daly.
All of a sudden he said, "I think it'd be kind of nice if I went and covered the Packers." I said, "Oh, really?" So he did. Came up here and just parked in front, which you could do then. And so he wasn't in there very long at all, and he just came out and said, "I got the job."
Art Daly was the sports editor of the Green Bay Press-Gazette.
Just your big, tall Irishman, big, friendly guy. Art loved the Packers, loved writing about them.
Our whole life revolved around football. I couldn't have a conversation without Dad saying, "You know, that reminds me of the game in 1953 when such and such and such happened." I mean, it just oozed out of him.
Art was always very positive and very upbeat, and even in a loss, Art would try to pick out what were some of the good things about that game.
Covered them in the style of the day, very team-friendly approach, but he was a born raconteur, born storyteller.
He would talk about the good things the Packers did.
He had all the books and the game guides, letters from other coaches and teams, and he was entrenched in it. He loved it.
Alongside Art, a new up-and-coming sports writer climbs the Press-Gazette ranks.
Art Daly and Lee Rimmel. The very fact that Lee ended up with the Packers, they were joined at the hip.
I was a cityside reporter at the Press-Gazette, and I happened to have my desk next to George W. Calhoun. I asked him if I paid my own expenses to Milwaukee for a game against the Detroit Lions, would he allow me to write the sidebars? And he said yes. That was the beginning of it. Having had that opportunity whetted my appetite to do more.
Art would do the game, but Lee did the sidebar stories.
With Art, it was mostly all business. Rimmel, however, vastly different.
Lee was a different breed of cat than Art Daly. Lee had a very flowery use of the English language, and that reflected Lee's love of language, first of all, but also the Packers.
We got a lesson in the English language, reading what he had to say.
Press-Gazette was a backer of the team.
They were warp and woof tied to the Packers.
People who are not Packer fans, Lee Remmel would have converted them. It's a big deal.
Even when we lost the game, if you read the Press-Gazette, you thought the Packers won the game, you know.
The relationship between the Green Bay Press-Gazette and the Green Bay Packers was valuable to the Packers because they were basically a small business that needed some unpaid advertising, needed some promotion, and at a time that they needed it most, the Press-Gazette was there to help them along their way.
Everybody in town was reading their sports page, so it was reciprocal. Both parties got something out of it.
The 1944 season sees its share of struggles. Packers versus Bears at City Stadium, September 24th.
Packers jumped out, fortunately, happily, to a 28-0 lead, and the Bears stormed back and tied it up. And in the fourth quarter, the Packers scored a Lou Brock, and then Ted Fritsch, who was an all-league fullback for the Packers, but also played linebacker, intercepted a pass and ran it back 55 yards for a touchdown, and the Packers won 42-28. So it was a great day.
It was kind of a different year. They won the right games and looked good enough, played well enough against enough teams, have enough wins to get to the championship game, where they again played the Giants.
Before a crowd of 46,016 fans, the Packers beat the Giants in New York, December 17th, 1944. Lambeau wins his 6th NFL title.
The first one's in 1929. 15 years later, he wins again in 1944. So he won with totally different rosters. Being able to, year after year, put out a winner, that consistency it's very hard to do.
The 1944 Packers championship team had this solid nucleus of linemen. Buckets Goldenberg's still there. Charlie Brock's playing and in the prime of his career. Baby Ray was a giant for his time. 6'7", 250 to 270 pounds. Just a good, solid tackle.
Real fine defensive football player. He was one of the first big men they had up at Green Bay. Came from Vanderbilt.
They had some young backs. Ted Fritsch, Tony Canadeo. That was really a well-rounded team.
One of Green Bay's advantages is that the players like playing here, which adds to the team chemistry.
Packers aren't raising a lot of money. They're not drawing big crowds at home. So there had to be something that appealed to these players. One of the things was the charm of a small town. The gathering place was the Astor Hotel.
It was the little sister of the three big hotels in town, but it was a place where they were very welcoming to a lot of the rookies that came to town. They stayed there.
Sue Allen was a surrogate mother for the players. She ran the front desk at the Astor Hotel.
Wallen took good care of all those Packer players and made sure that they wrote letters home to their moms and made sure that they had clean shirts.
She'd even call their mothers and report on them once in a while when she didn't like what she saw.
But the end of the war changes the landscape of professional football, and Curly Lambeau is falling out of favor with fans.
He went Hollywood and he got a little too big for his britches.
People are not exactly happy about him and some of his Hollywood-like ways.
Lambeau spends most of the off-season in California, socializing with the Hollywood elite.
He marries another woman from California who had been the ex-wife of a Hollywood producer.
Hollywood gossip columnist Luella Parsons reports Lambeau has been secretly married for 4 months. This third marriage, Grace Nichols.
She moves to Green Bay, doesn't stay happy very long. And so he had another short marriage. I don't know that Curly ever stopped womanizing.
Some of those starlets that he hung with, it changed the direction that his life went.
He's very flamboyant. He always drove a sporty, really nice car around, and he was a party man.
Good looking, charismatic.
He was always a well-groomed man. He wore gray flannels rather, and he wore black top coats and black overcoats, and he wore the Homburg hat.
He was always alive and ready and smiling, and he had a way and everybody seemed to like him.
A smooth-talking master salesman.
Lee Remmel once told me he could charm the birds out of trees.
And he was somewhat a little bit of a phony. He would have 3 different contracts, and when I asked for a raise, he would say to me, well, would you like more than Hudson or Hinkle? And he would show me their contracts. He would be very nice or very mean, and he would always work towards our sympathies.
He's basically one of those people that everything that came out of his mouth was a lie.
He was very persuasive, charming.
The spending habits he had developed wasn't something the board of directors was happy about.
Lambeau was spending money excessively on things other than football.
1946, Lambeau approaches the board of directors about a training facility. His thinking, years ahead of its time.
Curly was extremely creative, and he was also very competitive. It really allowed him to be this forward thinking.
The housing shortage became a serious matter in the mid-40s. That was the impetus for buying Rockwood Lodge.
They had some housing there, so he could get away for training camp.
The board unanimously votes to purchase the Rockwood Lodge, 18 miles from Green Bay, along the Bay shoreline.
Rockwood was like a European chateau, beautiful building. And they had apartments upstairs, they had cottages in the back for married players.
A lot of the ball players couldn't find places to live, and they had places out there where they could stay, and they lived there, actually, right at the camp. And the only bad part about Rockwood Lodge is they had to haul dirt in there and make a new playing field.
The city of Green Bay was not real happy with the situation. The Packers had been involved in the community so much. Business people downtown weren't seeing the players the way they did before.
What's more important than the community was that the players during the first practice discovered there is no topsoil in Door County.
I mean, there was some grass, but it was just barely covering up rocks underneath.
It was a bad situation because there was no place to practice. The rocks kept coming up through. So I went to him. We all had to eat breakfast together. We had to stay together and everything else out there. I said, Curly, if we don't get off of this field out here, we're going to have some football players that are not going to be able to even run anymore.
Rockwood Lodge isn't all bad. Many players found the living conditions ideal. As quoted by Green Bay Packers back Herman Stumpy Rory, it was beautiful. They built little homes outside the lodge, and the wives came up and stayed with the guys. Free meals, steak at night. That was pretty plush living.
It was somewhat secluded, so the players would pretty much have to focus on football and only football.
But the amount of money paid for it put a strain on the organization.
Along with the troubles of Rockwood Lodge and Curly's lifestyle coming into question, Lambeau is criticized for his outdated game strategy. The tide of 30 years of success is shifting.
He learned the passing game from Newt Rockne at Notre Dame.
You had the 4 players in the backfield, and all 4 of those players needed to be able to, at various times, be able to block, to fake.
His backs in that Notre Dame box needed to be versatile, and they shared the load, passing, running, and punting.
You get the snap from center, you'd have to turn and hand it to somebody or fake it to him. There was a whole different routine that you had to know.
In 1947, Lambeau abandons his Notre Dame box offense and switches to a variation of the T formation.
Most teams are running the T formation, and the Packers were one of the last 2 teams, along with Pittsburgh, to make the change.
We started going 2 ways, which was a novelty for most of the Green Bay boys because the Rams and other teams, the Bears, were going 2 ways a few years before we did.
Lambeau was really out of his element, running anything other than his box.
Changes on the field coincide with changes off the field. A rift develops when Lambeau hires the former PR director for the NFL, George Strickler.
Previously, he had been sports editor of the Chicago Tribune.
He becomes the new Packer assistant GM and director of public relations.
There was always a connection between the Tribune and Lambeau because of Arch Ward, who were contemporaries at Notre Dame, and Strickler had worked for Ward.
George Calhoun, co-founder of the team, discovers he's been replaced when he rips the news story off the wire in the Green Bay Press-Gazette newsroom.
He was there at the beginning. He was at that first organizational meeting, the second organizational meeting. For the next 30 years, George Whitney Calhoun wrote about the Packers.
He really helped promote the Packers and really made them more than just this town team in Green Bay.
It was about as bitter of a breakup as you could have. Two men who had accomplished so much together.
He will not give Lambeau the satisfaction of firing him. Calhoun states in a letter to team president Lee Joannes, well, it's a rather drab way of ending 28 years of football service with the Packers. However, I have the personal satisfaction of knowing that I more than did my part in helping the Packers rise to national acclaim in the professional football world. George Whitney Calhoun resigns.
Calhoun always said that he wanted to live long enough to pee on Lambeau's grave.
There's people critical of how he coached or his strategy on the field.
Several committees were appointed that included executive committee members and board directors that would run most facets of the franchise.
A power struggle begins with Lambeau that haunts him the remainder of his tenure. Weekly meetings are called. Lambeau is mandated to attend.
His public image is kind of faded a little bit in Green Bay. People are not exactly happy about him.
At one of those weekly meetings, Lambeau efforts a flex of authority, instilling his own set of rules. He announces he's going to fine players for what he calls spiritless performance.
He certainly wanted to control his players.
He was really trying to force his changes. I mean, he had been used to always really kind of getting his way, and the team on the field had been declining.
The decision follows a 17-7 loss to the Chicago Cardinals. He fines his players 50% of their salary.
He had losing seasons in 48 and 49, and so that's certainly going to turn off the fan base.
1948, the Packers finished 3-9, their first losing season in 15 years.
It was the only time they ever finished in the second division. The football fans in this section of the country, they've really been yelling bloody murder.
1949, the Packers lose their opener to the Bears. And Curley announces shortly after the game that he is stepping down as coach, and he was going to be an advisory coach for the remainder of the season.
If Curley had continued at the rate he was going, who knows what would have happened.
Lambeau plans to focus on his duties as vice president and general manager. The team is now coached by its assistants.
And Lambeau probably still calling the shots from a press box.
Almost 30 years that he was involved in football in Green Bay. He'd done everything. And I think that it just happened that he slowed down, lost interest. Maybe the challenge wasn't there anymore.
The move raises eyebrows, but the board is preoccupied with an even more pressing issue. Another major financial crisis looms for the Packers and for the 3-year-old All-America Football Conference. November 1949.
The All-America Football Conference started play in 1946 and survived for 4 seasons.
These All-American Football Conference owners were pretty wealthy people, but even they were taking some big hits.
The cost of doing business went up. You had to pay more for players. There was a bidding war for draft picks. Packers lost a couple of their number 1 draft choices to the other conference.
They were looking at pretty significant deficit. It definitely was possible the team was going to go under.
I had my secretary buzz me one day and said, "There are 3 gentlemen outside would like to speak with you as soon as you might have time." And I asked her who they were, and said Mr. Lambeau and Mr. Fisher and Mr. Johnnet. Mr. Fisher was the president at that time. Mr. Johnnet was secretary-treasurer. I invited him in. I said, "To what do I owe this honor?" And Curley did the talking, and he said, "Well, he said, we're having a problem. We're in debt, and we've got to raise $50,000 fast, or we could be in a problem with the franchise. We want to know if you would head a campaign to get it."
Close to 100 Packer backers gather for breakfast on November 14th at the Hotel Northland.
It looked like the team could fold.
They might not even be able to play their final 2 road games. So that was a crisis of major proportion.
Those who have gathered devise a plan to hold an inter-squad game. The goal, raise $50,000.
Business people in the community organized that inter-squad all-star game Thanksgiving Day of 1949 to help erase that debt and save the team.
In spite of freezing, blustery weather, fans huddle on wooden benches.
Temperature was about 15 that day, 11 o'clock in the morning.
Snow-covered field, snow in the wooden bleachers at City Stadium, and they draw close to 15,000 fans.
The Press-Gazette refers to it as having a carnival air. Football greats from 4 decades are honored. The game meaningless to their season, crucial to their future.
That Thanksgiving Day game more than raised money. It created, helped to renew and rebuild enthusiasm.
There's just that special connection between the Packers and the fans.
I was there with my dad. I remember him talking to me about, we're going to go to the game on Thanksgiving. I was really looking forward to it. About $50,000 was raised with that game. That was a significant factor in the team surviving.
Just 1 week following the money-raising inter-squad game, the board meets to discuss Lambeau's new contract.
There was a meeting at the Brown County Courthouse on November 30th, 1949.
There was a number of sports writers, media people, some radio announcers waiting outside, puffing on their cigarettes.
And I was waiting for the results of that meeting. It was a long and acrimonious meeting. It lasted about 5 hours.
They could hear shouting among the board members as they discussed Lambeau's contract.
He was the Green Bay Packers, essentially, at that time.
From 1919 to this point, it's been Curly Lambeau and the Green Bay Packers for 30-some years. He's the face of the franchise. You wonder where the franchise is going to be headed.
George Whitney Calhoun had been working behind the scenes to try to get the support of other board members to vote no on the contract extension and essentially fire Lambeau.
There are 3 no votes: Dr. W.W. Kelly, Gerald Clifford, and co-founder George Calhoun.
In the end, they voted to extend by an 18-3 vote.
He came out and announced that he had been rehired as head coach, general manager, and vice president for 2 years.
Rumors brew.
The Packers were in financial difficulty, insolvency, and if you're ever going to pounce, that's the time to do it.
You see, he had a pretty free hand with running the ball club. We went on accounting of what's going on with this football team. Then I think that's when all the problems started.
He told the committee, I happen to be on it, that he had 4 investors who would each put up $50,000 if we would change it to a profit-making corporation.
Curly Lambeau is making a move to take over the Green Bay Packers organization.
There's been a lot written about Curly's role and whether he wanted to move the Packers, whether he wanted to take control of them, turn them into a private corporation.
In a sense, Curly was entitled to it, except, of course, the fact that this had to be a community football team, and ownership had to stay in Green Bay.
My dad and his group of people on the executive committee resisted Lambeau's attempts to take over the franchise.
He was hoping to form a private corporation, and this was going to be a private stock sale. Curly was engaged in a power struggle. Not only was he fighting for his job, but also for the full authority he once had in ruling the franchise.
Starr goes back to throw, fires a pass, complete to McGee. He's at the 30-yard line.
We're not done yet.
The Vince Lombardi Trophy is coming home.
The Packer band leader came in my dad's place in a little bit north of Sturgeon Bay, and he saw me with my baton, and I was twirling, and that's all I ever did. You know, Mary, he said, I think I'd like to see you out on the football field, and I said, ask my mother. He said, you're going to be on next Sunday, and it was in the old stadium, and that was the start. I did it, and it was wonderful. And they were all yelling, that is Packer Golden Girl, Packer Golden Girl. And I would throw my baton up and try to, catch it. I was assuming I'd catch it. In the paper the next day, it said that Green Bay's Packer Golden Girl did quite a job. Go Pack Gold, go Pack Gold, da 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 da. Then that was one of the routines too.